An often overlooked area of your bike is its headset. It's a vital component providing you with smooth, safe and reliable steering. Headsets can take a lot of abuse over time, especially with the rough roads and the wet weather. Servicing a headset can seem like a bit of a daunting task, but in this video we're going to break it down into a few simple steps so that you can do this at home. Your headset consists of two main bearings, one at the top here and one further down here. Now, depending on which type of headset you have, the bearings either sit within the frame or within external cups. What we're going to achieve today is to remove all of these components, clean out the grease and grime that's left behind from the winter conditions, and replace everything with fresh grease. So how do you know if you need to replace your headset bearings? Well, if they've never been changed for many years, it's probably time for that now. So how can you tell if you need to replace them? Quite often, by turning the handlebars, you can feel rough or notchy feeling coming through the handlebars, and trust me, that's not what you want to feel. In this video, we're going to cover the most modern standard of headset, the A headset. Now, if you've got a slightly older bike or a very old bike, it will have a slightly different system. It may well use an external cup at the top and bottom here, or even a quill stem system. Now, while these do differ, the principles remain the same. The headset works by applying a small bit of compression using the top cap here to hold the bearings in place and keep it all together whilst not restricting movement side to side. For most headsets, you're only going to need a few basic tools, a 4 and 5mm Allen key, and at the end, a torque wrench to torque it up correctly to the manufacturer's specifications. Most mechanics will have these at home and they're easily accessible tools. So let's make a start. To begin with, we're going to remove the front wheel to reduce the amount of weight hanging from the forks when we take the bike apart. Now, if your bike has got integrated or hidden cables like this bike here, you may well have to remove 1 or 2 covers to help gain access to the parts you require. With that cover removed, we can now look to undo the top cap and stem bolts to remove these from the bike and help gain access to the next components. With the stem removed, the forks are technically free to fall all the way through the frame and onto the floor. However, because we've removed the front wheel, the friction of the headset is keeping it all in place. Had you left the front wheel in place, you'd probably be picking up a whole load of parts from all over the floor. At this point here, you'll need to make a mental note of the order of the spacers to ensure you can fit it back in the correct way. Now, you could also take a picture of this on your phone so that you can reference back to that when refitting the parts. Now that we've got that out of the way, we can look to remove these spacers and start to guide the forks down and out of the frame. Now, on a bike like this with integrated brake cables, you may well find a little bit easier if you remove the disc brake caliper here, enabling that extra bit of cable to give you some extra space to help guide the forks out from the frame. Now, if we're lucky, we'll guide the forks all the way down, carefully, and out like so. With the forks removed from the bike, it's best to try and avoid leaving everything hanging from the cables. You can use tape or ties to support the components in place. To support the handlebars, like I mentioned earlier, you can use some tape to wrap all the way around like so, and just hold that in place. Now, I've placed a cloth under here to make sure we don't scratch the frame. Now, if your bike has got integrated cables, like I mentioned earlier, you may well run into a few additional steps that you need to do. Like we found here, we've taken the forks out and we can see that the front brake hose runs all the way through, and we're going to have to remove that to enable us to slide this bearing off of the forks. Now, if like this bike, you've got an integrated brake hose, you're going to have to remove a small section of bar tape to enable you to gain access to the back of the shifter. From here, we can disconnect the brake hose from the shifter and guide that all the way down and out, enabling us to remove the lower bearing. Now, if you're careful and don't pull the brake lever, you will be able to refit these components without the need for bleeding the brake. Now that we've got all the components removed to gain access to the headset bearings, we can now assess the condition of them and decide if we need to replace them. Now, fortunately enough for these, both of the bearings feel to be in good condition, so all we need to do here is clean them up, refit some new grease to them, and then start to put the bike back together. Now, in this instance, if you found that the bearings did need replacing, on a bike such as this with integrated cables, you would have to remove the brake hoses to enable you to remove the bearings. It's a little bit of a more involved video, so we'll probably have to feature that later on. So to clean the bearing and the faces up, we take a clean cloth and some disc brake cleaner, spray it onto the cloth like this, and then it's a case of wiping the bearing carefully all around the face, lifting it up to gain access to the area that the bearing sits. Here we can remove all the old grit and grime that's built up over time. Now that we've got the lower bearing all cleaned up, we can replicate the process for the top bearing. Once both the top and lower bearings are clean, we can refit them with fresh grease and then start to reassemble the bike. Now that we've got the lower bearing cleaned and re-greased and cleaned inside the frame, we can replicate the process for the top bearing, and that will enable us to look to reinsert the fork to the frame. Now we can carefully guide the fork back into the frame, like so, taking care not to damage it. So now the forks are inserted in the bike, an extra bit of grease that we can use there. We can guide that all the way around the bearing. That'll enable the top race to sit carefully on there. To help with refitting the components on the top headset bearing, we can untape the forks and remove that out of the way to enable us to manoeuvre this around to make fitting a lot easier. Now that we've started to refit most of the components back over the steer of the fork, it's important to remember to refit the spaces we removed earlier in the correct order as they were removed. Now this is where you can go back and reference that picture you might have taken earlier. With the spacers correctly installed again, we can guide the stem over the steerer to help reassemble the components. With the forks and stem refitted to the bike, we can now install the top cap and the bolts. This will just help secure the forks in place to make sure they don't fall out. With that loosely secured, so now we can move down to the disc brake caliper, which we removed earlier to make it easier to remove the forks from the frame. Now if we go down here, it's important to reinstall this correctly and use the correct torque setting on the bolt to make this nice and safe. So before we can retighten the stem bolts, we need to make sure the top cap is securely tight. Now most bikes don't have a torque rating for this, as it will vary between bike to bike and depending on the condition of the headset. Now it's important to tighten it enough that the headset has got no free play, but not to restrict left to right movement. Now this bike happens to suggest 6 Newton meters, so that gives you a bit of a guideline. With the top cap bolt secured correctly, we can now look to reinstall the front wheel, center the brake caliper on the disc, and then redo the stem bolts, torquing them up correctly. Now we've done those steps, we can move on to centralising the handlebars like so, making sure they're nice and straight. Then we can use our torque wrench here to correctly and evenly torque the bolts on the stem. Now on a stem such as this one, these are 6 Newton meters, which we've got this preset tool for. So we do those nice and evenly until we hear the click of the torque wrench, indicating that they're done up correctly. Now that we've got all the components correctly assembled, it's worth just one final check to make sure everything is torqued correctly, and then we can go round with a clean cloth and wipe any excess grease that has come out from the side of the frame after assembly. With everything correctly assembled, our last and final check is to apply the front brake, and with one hand over the top of the headset, just ensure there is no excessive or free play in the headset, causing it to knock as you rock the bike forwards and backwards. And that's perfect. Now if when you're checking the headset for excessive play you do find some, all you're going to have to do is loosen the 2 stem bolts off, tighten the top cap a little bit more, re-torque the stem bolts and then check it again, and that should be perfect. Hopefully this video has helped you master the art of servicing a headset, and it's probably something you should consider doing every year or so anyway. Now if you've got any questions or other maintenance videos you'd like to see, as always let us know in the comments section down below.